Why would Caesar place his army between two larger forces and call it a plan? At Alesia, he encircled a hilltop city while a massive relief army gathered beyond the horizon, and he chose to fight both at once. It was not madness. It was geometry, discipline, and faith in interior lines. Two belts of fortification, one to hold the Gauls in, one to hold the world out. The Romans stood in the gap, moving reserves where the pressure peaked. If the ring broke, Caesar's career, his wealth, and perhaps the Roman project in Gaul would collapse in a day. The stakes were personal and political. Caesar needed a victory to return to Rome as the man who had pacified Gaul, not as a debtor general awaiting prosecution. His enemies watched every dispatch for weakness. The Gallic coalition tested more than Roman steel. It tested whether a political system could govern conquest without being consumed by it. If Caesar failed, Pompey's star would rise unchecked, and the elite could reassert control over commands and triumphs. If he succeeded, the balance would tilt toward men who commanded legions rather than votes. Victory at Alesia would open the road to civil war. This story begins at Alesia, but it doesn't end there. Across centuries, 7 Roman commanders redefined conquest until victory became a system. Scipio Africanus, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, Trajan, and Aurelian. They turned courage into doctrine and audacity into infrastructure. Each answered a different crisis: annihilation by Hannibal, manpower collapse, political paralysis, piracy strangling trade, stalemate in the West, frontiers that bled, an empire cracking apart. The shock is that solutions nested inside one another like traps. Save Rome in one generation, and you endanger it in the next. Consider what you would have done and what price you'd pay. Start with Scipio Africanus, a young officer who watched Rome suffer disaster after disaster and refused to learn the wrong lesson. He studied Hannibal's art, then built a Roman answer. At New Carthage, he struck with speed, tide, and silence. Seizing the harbor by exploiting a hidden ford at low water. At Zama, he absorbed the elephant charge, opened lanes, and unleashed superior cavalry to crumple Carthage's rear. His weapon was adaptation. His stakes were ancestral ghosts. His father and uncle had died in Spain. Unknown to Hannibal, Scipio wasn't copying tactics. He was copying the habit of learning faster. Then comes Marius, the ambitious outsider who promised salvation through reform. He opened recruitment to Rome's poorest citizens and made the state, not the soldier, responsible for kit. Packs grew heavier, marches longer, drills harsher. They called his men Marius's mules, and they won. At Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae, he broke invading tribes with deep reserves and iron cohesion, turning panic into pursuit. The intended prize was security. The unintended consequence was loyalty to the general who fed and settled you after service. Marius rose to 7 consulships. He also opened a door that the Republic could never close again. Sulla followed, elegant and icy, a patrician who treated war as arithmetic. In Greece, he besieged Athens and Piraeus without mercy, cutting supply lines, building rams, starving citizens to prove a lesson. Resistance would be priced in blood. Then he marched his legions into Rome itself, shattering a sacred boundary, and rewrote the rules with prescriptions that funded soldiers and terrorized opponents. The decisions solved one crisis and made another inevitable. Legions had learned the road to the capital. Consider what you would have done. Accept the humiliation of a rival's command, or gamble that intimidation could restore the Republic. Enter Pompey, the golden commander who conquered time. Pirates had strangled Mediterranean trade, raiding coasts, corrupting markets, and humiliating Rome. Given a sweeping mandate, he divided the sea into zones, synchronized fleets, offered amnesty to those who surrendered, and crushed those who did not. In months, the lanes were clear. In the east, he reorganized provinces, planted loyal kings, and built a revenue engine that fed armies. His genius was speed married to administration. But the real shock was how easily exceptional powers became standard. Unknown to many, the precedent he set would arm rivals able to outpace the Constitution. Caesar pushed further. He made audacity a logistics plan. He bridged the Rhine to announce reach, crossed to Britain to shape myth, and wrote his commentaries to seize the narrative. At Alesia, he turned earth and timber into a double blade that strangled a nation. He cultivated mercy as policy, and yet his rise ended in knives under the statue of Pompey, a paradox only Rome could produce. The decision to seek total preeminence doomed the Republican balance. Consider what you would have done. Accept a lesser triumph in safety, or bet everything that victory could rewrite the political order. Trajan, the soldier emperor, treated geography as a problem to solve. Against Dacia, he built roads, bridgeheads, and the colossal Danube Bridge, turning a river into a highway for legions. His sieges used towers, artillery, and patient strangulation. He commemorated the campaigns in a spiral of carved stone that still teaches: men building, bridging, dressing wounds, hauling artillery, binding conquered kings. Logistics was the language of his victories. Yet the reach to Mesopotamia strained garrisons and supply. The line between triumph and overreach narrowed. Was conquest sustainable as a habit, or was consolidation the wiser strategy for a tired empire? Last comes Aurelian, the restorer, forged by crisis. The 3rd century ripped the empire into pieces. Invasions, rebellions, economic chaos, emperors rising and falling like sparks. Aurelian concentrated force, led a fast, punishing cavalry arm, and smashed Palmyra in the east and the Gallic Empire in the west. He ringed Rome with vast walls, not as a boast but as insurance. Coins named him restorer of the world. His discipline was iron, his mercy limited. Unknown to his officers, a forged dossier would kill him before his consolidation set. The lesson lingered. Unity could be rebuilt, but never cheaply again. What made all this possible wasn't a single sword, but a machine. The Roman legion marched with shovels as faithfully as with pilla, and every night a fortified camp rose, a grid of order in hostile terrain. That grid gave interior lines, storage, platforms for artillery, and a place to rest bodies and sharpen resolve. Archaeologists still trace these rectangles across fields, stamped into soil by labor and fear. Consider what you would have done when crisis knocked. Open the ranks to the poor, like Marius, seize the city, like Sulla, compress time, like Pompey, or gamble, like Caesar, today. To follow these men across their gambles, you need the blueprint they trusted. Rome's secret wasn't mystical courage. It was structure, cohorts that moved like hinges, centurions who enforced discipline with bone-deep certainty, engineers who made ground a weapon, logisticians who turned grain into range, the camp, the road, the bridge, the law, the oath. When the system worked, a general could ask the impossible and hear yes. When it cracked, politics bled into battle lines. The next step is simple and decisive. How did the Roman military machine actually function, and why did it beat larger foes consistently? How did a Roman commander make larger armies break on command, and why did the cohort beat both phalanx and wild warband across continents? If you had 10,000 disciplined men facing 50,000 furious enemies, would you seek open ground or build the ground you needed? The Roman answer was simple and ruthless. Turn soldiers into engineers, drill until instinct replaces panic, and let organization become a weapon. This is the machine, born from citizen levies, hardened by reform, perfected by habit. It isn't just the sword, it's the camp, the road, the oath, the daily rhythm that makes courage reliable. Consider what you would have done if survival depended on routine. The early legion fought in maniples, small checkerboard blocks that could breathe and rotate, each with its own standards and officers. After decades of grind, the cohort took over as the basic unit, bigger than a maniple, flexible enough to reinforce or refuse a wing, sturdy under shock. The genius wasn't geometry alone. It was the human spine running through it. Centurions, not aristocrats, enforced reality. The primus pilus kept the first cohort steady when dust and screams shredded lines. Tribunes learned, legates delegated, but the centurion's vine staff made doctrine personal. Break formation, and you answered to a man you knew by name. Training was punishment disguised as preparation. March, dig, build, then drill again. Veterans joked that Marius turned men into pack animals, and the nickname stuck: Marius's mules. Each legionary carried tools, stakes, rations, spare footwear, and the kit to throw up a palisade before nightfall. Decimation existed, but it was the exception that proved a rule of constant, smaller penalties and relentless standards. The reward was certainty. A unit that could erect a fortified grid after a forced march could also align shields, launch pila, and close with the gladius without waiting for courage to arrive. Habit killed hesitation. Weapons reflected doctrine. The scudum, a curved body-length shield, turned men into a moving wall. The gladius thrust under its rim, fast and lethal in the crush where long blades tangled. Before contact, the pilum flew, a heavy javelin with a soft iron shank designed to bend on impact, pinning an enemy shield or forcing it to be dropped. Armor evolved with threats. Mail was common in the Republic. Scale and segmented plate appeared in imperial decades. But protection always served the same purpose: stay alive long enough to keep formation. Artillery was not exotic. Ballistae and scorpiones spat bolts to disrupt dense clusters and batter parapets. Command structure turned complexity into muscle memory. A consul or general set intent. Legates ran wings. Tribunes oversaw administration and training. Centurions executed contact decisions. Signals, horn calls, standards, messengers moved orders faster than panic could. The Aquila, the eagle, was more than metal. It was cohesion embodied, the rally point, and the honor of the unit. Because initiative was embedded downward, a Roman line could absorb surprise, refuse a flank, or rotate exhausted ranks without collapsing. This is why Caesar trusted veteran centurions with independent action and why Trajan could stretch lines across rivers, knowing subordinates would keep the lattice intact. The camp was a weapon disguised as shelter. Each evening, stakes went in, ditches were cut, a rampart rose, gates were aligned to the terrain, and streets laid out on a proven grid. Inside lay order, supply, medical spaces, command tents, corrals, artillery parks. Outside lay fear, a V-shaped ditch, sharpened obstacles, sometimes pits and snares. This fortified heartbeat gave interior lines. Reserves could move behind a wall to threaten points, while attackers slogged through obstacles under missiles. But the real shock was time. A trained legion could raise a fortified town between afternoon and dusk, and do it again tomorrow and the next day. Logistics turned ambition into range. Roads stitched Italy and the provinces into a predictable lattice of milestones, depots, and way stations. Grain was the fuel. Measured rations, hand mills, pack animals, and barges feeding forward stocks. Rivers were highways, bridges decisive. Trajan's massive Danube bridge did more than dazzle. It guaranteed that winter and flood would not dictate the campaign rhythm. At sea, control meant safety for supply. When pirates throttled the Mediterranean, Pompey divided the theater into zones, synchronized squadrons, and broke the problem in weeks. Strategy didn't end at the battlefield. It began with stomachs and ended with ships. Intelligence made movement safe. Exploratores scouted routes and water. Speculatores watched enemy camps. And interpreters coaxed information from merchants and local elites whose futures depended on guessing Rome's winners. Reports fed into maps in a commander's head, letting him choose where to force a crossing, spring an ambush, or refuse battle. Soft power worked alongside steel. Coins announced titles, proclamations promised clemency, and letters to city councils offered stability in exchange for gates opening at dawn. Consider what you would have done if your scouts reported a superior enemy massing ahead. March into glory, skirt away to cut supply, or lure them to your walls. When the lines finally met, Rome fought a choreography. Lock shields, throw, close, then grind. Against a phalanx, cohorts aimed at flanks and broken ground, using pila to tear the hedge of pikes and then shoving where the rigid formation couldn't pivot. Against tribal warbands, they absorbed the first roar, let missiles and fatigue erode momentum, then advanced behind the wall of Scuta in disciplined waves. Individual valor mattered inside that system. Caesar praised Scipio, a centurion who held a breach with wounds covering his body. He also praised Crestinus, who led the first charge at Pharsalus and died in the press. Courage served structure. Rome never fought with legionaries alone. Auxiliaries brought archers from Syria, slingers from the Balearics, and nimble cavalry from Numidia, and later the Danube. Light troops screened, scouted, and chased. Horse struck where infantry could not. Over time, cavalry grew heavier, lances longer, armor thicker, until shock action decided pursuits and routes. Aurelian's era leaned on fast, punishing mounted forces to break usurpers and invaders before they coalesced. The legions provided the anvil, auxiliaries the hammers. But the real shock was political. The machine drew strength from peoples it had conquered, granting citizenship in pay in exchange for service that protected and Romanized the frontiers. Archaeology proves that this wasn't legend tightened into memory. Across Britain and Germany, the ghost rectangles of marching camps still stain fields after plowing. Their V-ditches cut at a precise angle, their gates set in standard patterns. At Alesia, rows of pits and stakes match the written claims. Along the Danube, piers and reliefs attest to bridges built to defy seasons. Forts yield hobnails by the thousand, stamped tiles naming legions, workshop slag, altars raised by centurions, and medical tools that speak to organized care. Unknown to the builders, every trench they dug became a future map of how discipline writes itself into the ground. Now decide what kind of machine you'd build. If the state can't outfit its troops, do you, like Marius, open the ranks to the poorest and make equipment a public burden, knowing loyalty may pivot from senate to commander? If discipline falters, do you enforce terror, or do you cultivate pride and rewards to bind men tighter than fear can? If speed wins, do you strip baggage and risk hunger, or drag wagons and arrive safe but late? Each choice seems tactical in the moment, yet each one sets political fuses. The genius of Rome was seeing the battlefield as the last stage of administration, and that is why the legions kept winning against odds that should have broken them. Structure turned will into predictable outcomes. Yet the same system could tempt leaders to gamble, push faster, and bend laws to match their momentum. Next comes the test. A siege fought on two fronts. Would you trust the geometry? Why gamble everything by locking yourself between a besieged enemy and a roaming relief army? Why did Caesar at Alesia decide to fight two battles at once rather than defeat the defenders first? He chose geometry over numbers. Interior lines, layered fortification, and discipline that could move faster than panic. Consider what you would have done with winter approaching, allies wavering, and a coalition rising. Withdraw to safety, or stake your life on a double wall of dirt and timber. In the summer of 52 BCE, Vercingetorix had fused fractious Gallic tribes into a rare unity. After Roman setbacks at Gergovia, Caesar's aura of inevitability cracked. He needed an ending dramatic enough to erase doubt. Alesia, a stronghold on a long ridge above the river valleys, offered both bait and anvil. If he could trap the Gallic leader and survive the inevitable rescue, he would break the will to resist and return to Rome with triumph assured. If he failed, he would be the debtor general Rome was waiting to prosecute. The plan began with earth. Around Alesia, Caesar drew a tight ring, circumvallation, to strangle the town's supplies and prevent sorties. He added another wider ring, contravallation, to hold off the relief force he knew would come. Between ditches and ramparts, he set obstacles the commentaries list with a craftsman's pride. Twin ditches, one filled with diverted water, a rampart crowned with a palisade, towers at regular intervals, and before the main ditch, fields of traps, lilia, funnel-shaped pits with sharpened stakes, Scipii, interlaced branches set like hidden hedgehogs, and stimuli, iron barbs planted to tear feet and courage. Each feature stole speed. Each minute saved the legions. Inside those lines, the Roman camp pulsed like a heart. Supplies moved along the neat streets. Artillery crews sighted their engines. Cavalry awaited the trumpet. Caesar had perhaps 10 legions in the field, though detachments and attrition complicate the count. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix commanded tens of thousands in the hopes of Gaul. Beyond the horizon, messengers raced to summon a relief army 100,000 strong by ancient boasts, still vast by sober estimate. Unknown to them, Caesar was counting distances, not men. His lines were shorter, his reserves could leap by road and gate while the Gauls had to scramble over hills. Sieges turned strategy into hunger. As days passed, grain dwindled. Vercingetorix expelled the non-combatants, the Mandubii and others, women, children, the old, hoping the Romans would allow them through. Caesar refused. They starved in the ditch between walls, a silent accusation neither side could answer. The decision was merciless and militarily sound. He would not sacrifice rations or morale for pity. Consider what you would have done with your own men hungry, your enemy's civilians pleading under your ramparts. A single gate open to compassion could become a flood. Meanwhile, the relief army assembled under chiefs like Commius, Viridomarus, and Apollodorix. They carried the fury of burned farms and the prestige of a union not seen in generations. Caesar learned of their approach from scouts and Gallic allies hedging their bets. He posted cavalry patrols far forward and kept cohorts ready to mass on threatened sectors. The whole design rested on interior lines. He could not be everywhere, but he could arrive faster than any attacker crossing broken ground. But the real shock was how the double wall turned an outnumbered army into two. The same soldiers defended inward and outward, anchored by timber and fear. The first major assaults tested the outer ring. Columns advanced with hurdles to fill ditches, wicker mantelets to fend off missiles, and ladders for the rampart. Roman artillery answered with bolts and stones that tore gaps in nerve. When attackers reached the obstacles, the traps did their quiet work, tripping feet, breaking formations, clogging ditches with bodies and beams. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix probed the inner wall, timing thrusts to the rhythm of the outer battle. Each push forced Caesar to choose: commit reserves outward and risk a breakout, or guard the inner line and risk collapse under numbers. He shifted cohorts like weights on a scale and held. The second day magnified the pressure. The relief commanders concentrated on a sector where the ground narrowed the Roman line. They attacked at dawn and again toward dusk, trying to exhaust the defenders and sleep in their ditch. Inside, Vercingetorix launched a furious sally. Torches flared, engines groaned, and for a choking hour the Romans gave ground on the inner rampart. Centurions dragged men back into ranks by the throat strap of the helmet, swearing by the eagle and the pay they hadn't yet earned. Consider what you would have done with laboring lungs and messengers pleading from both walls. Send the last reserve outward, or keep a cold hand on the inner ring. On the third day the Gauls tried cunning. Vercassivellaunus, a kinsman of Vercingetorix, led a picked column on a night march to a distant hill that looked down on the northwest sector of the Roman works. The ground there was awkward, the defenses less developed, the ditches shallower where the slope cut them. At first light he fell on that point with chosen warriors carrying hooks, poles, and fascines, while the main relief army surged against the opposite flank and the garrison within Alesia synchronized another sally. Unknown to the Romans on other fronts, this wedge was angled at the hinge of Caesar's whole machine. Caesar understood. He sent Labienus, his most reliable lieutenant, to stabilize the threatened sector and hold it at all costs. Labienus fought with the gravity of a man who knew the political stakes as well as the tactical ones. He gathered cohorts from neighboring forts, stiffened the line with centurions who shouted their oaths rather than prayers, and signaled for help. Caesar rode to the crisis, putting on the crimson general's cloak that told every legionary where the center of gravity now stood. He gathered fresh cohorts, stripped from quieter sectors, and made a reserve behind Labienus. To abandon the lighter pressure elsewhere was to invite catastrophe there. To delay here was to lose the campaign. He chose speed. The fight became a maelstrom. Gauls hurled down bundles to flatten the obstacles and clawed at the palisade. Romans thrust pila like spears and then used them as levers to wrench away ladders. When the line wavered, Labienus took an eagle, symbol and magnet, and pushed forward with a wedge to reclaim the parapet. Caesar committed his last reserve, then unleashed the ripcord of his plan. The German cavalry, held back for a decisive stroke, swept around the exterior and smashed into the flank and rear of Vercassivellaunus's column. From the inner wall, Roman cohorts burst out in a sudden sortie to add pressure from another side. Signals flickered, horns brayed, and momentum shifted. What began as a breach became a trap. Once the cavalry slammed home, panic spread as fast as a rumor. Exhausted attackers saw missiles in their faces and horsemen at their backs. The wedge disintegrated, for Cassivellaunus was captured amid the rout. On the other fronts, the relief army saw banners tilt and dust rise where success should have been. Their own pushes faltered. The men inside Alesia fell back behind their gates. The double battle had ended the same minute on both rings. The next day, Vercingetorix convened a council, armed himself in ceremonial fashion, and rode out. He laid his weapons at Caesar's feet and sat silent. The surrender was a political act as much as a military one, an acknowledgement that Gaul could unite to bleed Rome, but not to beat it. Why did Caesar win? Interior lines turned space into time. Towers and trenches multiplied numbers he didn't have. Economy of force kept pressure bearable everywhere until a decisive moment arrived somewhere. He used engineering as a weapon, not a backdrop, and he trusted a cadre of centurions and legates to hold without guidance while he made a single timely decision. His opponents lacked a common doctrine. Their synchronization failed over distance and terrain. They had courage in abundance. They lacked the communications and rehearsed contingencies that let a system act like a single organism. But the real shock was moral. To win, Caesar chose starvation over pity and spectacle over compromise. Victory was bought with choices that etched themselves into Roman politics. Why would a Roman general march his legions into his own capital, defy sacred boundaries, and dare the Senate to stop him? Why risk turning the army from a shield of the state into its master? The answer begins as a quarrel over credit and ends as a strategy of power. In the late Republic, political victory became a campaign plan, and the city itself turned into a battlefield. Consider what you would have done if your rival seized a command meant for you, submit to procedure and fade, or break the rules and write new ones in steel. The seed was sown in North Africa. In the Jugurthine War, Marius rose as the tough outsider promising victory through grit, while his subordinate, the younger Sulla, engineered the diplomatic coup that delivered Jugurtha in chains by flipping King Bocchus of Mauritania. Marius took the triumph. Sulla took the grudge and had a signet carved showing the surrender was his. Pride metastasized into policy. During the Social War, when Rome fought its Italian allies, both men built reputations and networks among soldiers who would remember who supplied pay, plunder, and promotion. The army was becoming a career. The generals, careers patrons. The flashpoint came in 88 BCE, when the Senate entrusted the war against Mithridates of Pontus to Sulla. A tribune, Sulpicius Rufus, pushed through a law transferring the command to Marius. Sulla, encamped at Nola with legions forged in the Italian War, chose the unthinkable. He marched on Rome. Tactically, he moved fast, exploited confusion, and seized key nodes before opponents could muster militia. Strategically, he replaced the Republic's principle, laws rule armies, with a new one. Armies decide laws. The precedent cracked the city's shell, but the real shock was how easily soldiers followed. Their loyalty was not to a marble abstraction. It was to the man who had led, paid, and promised. When the Eastern crisis demanded action, Sulla left for Greece. Politics followed him. He lacked a fleet and money, so he minted coin from temple treasuries, cut down the sacred groves around Athens to build engines and ramps, and set about a systematic strangulation. Aristian's Athens starved. Piraeus, fortified by Archelaus, held out behind walls and Macedonian help. But Sulla built and battered until breaches opened. The sack of Athens was a lesson in punitive deterrence. Resist, and Rome will strip you to bone. Then came battles at Chaeronea and Orchomenus, where Sulla annihilated Mithridatic armies by forcing them to fight on ground he prepared, leveraging entrenchments and disciplined counterstrokes. Politics and tactics braided into one rope: finance, logistics, annihilation, and a statement that the new Roman way would be remorseless. Back in Italy, Marian forces, revived under Cinna and later faction leaders, prepared to contest Sulla's return. He landed in 83 BCE with veterans who had learned his arithmetic of war. The decisive collision came at the Colline Gate in 82, where Samnite allies of the Marian cause tried to break Rome itself. Sulla won on the edge of collapse. Victory was followed by proscriptions, public lists of enemies to be killed on sight. Heads appeared in the forum. Property was confiscated to pay soldiers and settle them on land. Terror was not madness, it was administration by other means. Consider what you would have done with an army to reward and a senate to discipline. Could you disband them both and hope the old rules returned? Sulla dressed his violence in constitutional garments. He became dictator legibus faciendis et re publicae constituendi for making laws and rebuilding the state. He increased the Senate, curbed the tribune's power to propose laws, rewired courts to favor senatorial juries, and locked magistracies into a stricter sequence. Then, astonishingly, he resigned and retired. He may have believed he'd restored equilibrium. In reality, he had normalized the march on Rome, the purge as policy, and the notion that the Constitution was clay in the hands of the armed. The next generation would test those lessons with frightening competence. From Sulla's shadow stepped Pompey. He had raised troops on his own authority in the civil wars and delivered victories in Sicily and Africa, earning from Sulla the half-mocking, half-admiring title Magnus, the Great. As a young commander, he learned to move quickly, exploit surprise, and convert victories into political capital. In Spain, he fought the gifted rebel Sertorius. After Sertorius' assassination by jealous allies, Pompey finished the war and returned demanding a triumph, bending the constitution to accommodate a commander without the usual magistracies. Unknown to the Senate, it had taught a wolf to open the sheepfold door. The crisis of piracy revealed his method. Pirate fleets had turned the Mediterranean into a ransom lake, cutting grain routes, raiding coasts, and humbling provinces. In 67 BCE, amid famine fears, the people granted Pompey sweeping imperium through the Lex Gabinia. He divided the sea into operational zones, assigned sub-commanders to each, and synchronized sweeps so no band could slip through gaps. He offered amnesty and resettlement to those who surrendered and annihilation to those who didn't. Within months, sea lanes cleared. The tactics were simple, the strategy brilliant. Theater control, time compression, and administrative follow-through. But the real shock was constitutional. Emergency powers, once unthinkable, now seemed efficient. Efficiency has a long memory. Pompey's next command, won through the Lex Manilia, took him to the east to finish what Lucullus began against Mithridates. He reorganized provinces, annexed Syria, adjusted the fates of client kings, and built durable tax systems. He did not just conquer, he administered. The lesson was not lost on rivals. Success required both sword and census. Yet at home, senatorial elites feared the size of his patronage network. They stalled settlements for his veterans and refused to ratify all his arrangements. Pompey needed an ally who could extract legislation from a hostile aristocracy. That ally was Julius Caesar, and the deal they cut would bend the city's politics to their combined will. The first triumvirate was an understanding, not an office. Caesar brought charm and political agility. Pompey brought military prestige. Crassus brought wealth. Caesar married his daughter Julia to Pompey, sealing the pact with family. As consul in 59 BCE, he bulldozed resistance to pass agrarian laws and secure his long proconsulship in Gaul. He then wrote the most effective political communications in ancient history, his commentaries, presenting campaigns as necessity, victories as security, and himself as instrument rather than instigator. He practiced clemency as strategy, offering defeated tribes and senators alike a path back to dignity under his supremacy. The battlefield and forum blurred. Information became a weapon. When Julia died and Crassus fell at Carrhae, the balance broke. The Senate, fearful of Caesar's power and prodded by Pompey's camp, demanded he dismiss his legions before standing for consul. Caesar chose transgression with meticulous caution. Crossing the Rubicon in 49 BCE was theater and plan. He moved at speed down the Adriatic spine, accepted surrenders, secured treasuries, and offered clemency to wavering elites. Pompey, calculating that he could not hold Italy without risking a pitched battle at disadvantage, withdrew to Greece to rally forces from the east. Caesar understood the geometry, interior lines, and momentum. Politics now rode on campaign marches. Civil war decisions carried personal stakes that echoed in households. Caesar's leniency was part moral claim, part recruitment of the future. Many accepted, some waited, calculating odds. After Pharsalus, where Pompey's strategy of delay met Caesar's insistence on choice ground and killer tempo, Pompey fled to Egypt and was murdered on arrival, a final humiliation for a man who had tamed the sea. Caesar wept, or said he did, and moved to settle Egypt's succession in a swirl of politics and romance that fed his enemies' fears. Back in Rome, he accumulated titles and projects, calendars reformed, debt rescheduled, colonies planned. He never quite returned power to the marble halls that claimed to own it. The assassination was staged at a site that still speaks, the Theater of Pompey. Senators gathered not in the Curia but in a place built by Caesar's rival, under statues celebrating victory and rivalry both. The knives flashed in 44 BCE. The conspirators imagined they were restoring the Republic. They had misread the new arithmetic. Without a clear plan, their act detonated a crisis they could not manage. Archaeology fixes the irony. Foundations of the theater survive, and beneath later layers, the outline of a dictatorship's end still hides in Rome's crowded ground. Politics had become a tactic, and the tactic required an army. The imperial solution emerged as a new balance between soldier and senate. Trajan exemplified it. Adopted by Nerva to stabilize a nervous system, he cultivated the image of the first citizen who marched with his troops and respected senatorial dignity while ignoring senatorial vetoes. He built and built forums, roads, bridges, folding legitimacy into stone and concrete. His column wound the story of Dacia's defeat in a spiral that taught citizens what victory looked like from the saw pit and field kitchen, not just the rostrum. His rule proved an emperor could centralize decision-making, expand with discipline, and still reassure Rome's elites, provided he translated conquest into public works and reliable pay. 2 centuries later, Aurelian faced a world that seemed to be burning from the edges inward. Emperors had become short-lived captains of garrisons, coinage had crumbled, and the empire split into shards. The Gallic Empire in the west, Palmyra in the east. Aurelian answered with concentration and speed. He smashed the Palmyrene field armies, captured Zenobia after Emesa, and later erased the Gallic separatists. He wrapped Rome in walls vast enough to terrify future invaders and to reassure a population that the emperor could still protect the heartland. Coins proclaimed Rested Victor Orbis, restorer of the world, using currency as a loudspeaker for order reclaimed. Then came the quiet betrayal. A forged dossier convinced officers their lives were at risk. They killed the man who had saved them. The lesson was ugly and clear. Even as the strongest ruler could not outpace a system that manufactured coups as easily as coins. Across this arc, the tactical logic of politics hardened. Marches on Rome were operational choices, enabled by units loyal to men rather than norms. Prescriptions financed victory lists. Extraordinary commands solved emergencies by creating new ones. Information warfare, speeches, pamphlets, decrees, and coins built narratives that kept armies supplied and cities obedient. Archaeology grounds this story. The Theater of Pompey, where blood fell, Aurelian's walls still encircling modern streets, coins stamped with claims of restoration and victory, inscriptions recording grants to veterans whose settlements changed provincial maps. Power was written in materials as surely as in laws. But the real shock was that the Republic died of its own habits. Success rewarded speed, concentration, and personal loyalty. Those same traits, when turned inward, cracked the civic shell. The men we admire for tactical brilliance taught their followers how to trade legality for tempo, how to turn emergency into normality, and how to bury opposition under the promise of stability. Consider what you would have done as a senator watching grain ships arrive only after Pompey's extraordinary command, as a centurion owed land after Sulla's wars, as a city elder promised safety by Caesar if you opened your gates before dawn. Do you defend principle and risk famine, mutiny, and sack? Or do you accept a savior and hope correction comes later? Modern strategists will recognize the pattern: emergency powers that linger, security that demands centralization, narratives that justify the necessary now and the unavoidable later. Rome shows that political systems survive battlefield shocks better than repeated exceptions. Yet for centuries, the empire functioned because emperors like Trajan and, later, administrators under the steadier rulers translated power into roads, walls, grain, and courts. The army's loyalty could be shaped by predictable pay and honor as much as by terror. Politics, at its best, became logistics writ large. The next question is not theoretical. What did these power plays mean for ordinary lives? What happened in the streets and markets when a general secured land for veterans? When pirates vanished from the sea? When walls rose around a capital in fear? How did conquered peoples learn to live under the men who had broken them? The answer lies in culture and routine, in the mundanity of rations, taxes, citizenship, and law. The battlefield had come home. Now it would come to the farm, the workshop, and the forum. Consider what you would have done as a Gallic noble offered Roman citizenship, or as a veteran promised land in a new colony. The next campaign unfolds in daily life. How do you hold what you conquer? With fear, with favors, or with a routine so persuasive that resistance feels inefficient? Rome chose all three, in sequence and in combination, turning victory into administration. The empire's great tactic was not a formation on a field, but a program. Roads for legions that became roads for merchants, law for citizens that became law for allies, and grants of status that turned former enemies into guardians of the frontier. Conquest bled into daily life. A campaign line became a property line, a pay chest became a tax base, a treaty became a census. Consider what you would have done if a Roman governor offered security, markets, and rank in exchange for loyalty to an empire that had just burned your harvest. After Alesia, the Roman offer to Gallic elites was sharper than a sword, hostages and tribute now, but protection, courts, and prestige if you cooperate. Caesar's clemency was policy. A noble from the Aedui could keep his estates, send a son to learn Latin rhetoric, and sit on a municipal council that collected taxes and recruited auxiliaries. Accept the deal and your family might flourish under imperial patronage. Refuse and see your rivals take your place. Unknown to many chiefs, the social war to come would be fought in schools and markets. Language shifted, clothes changed, contracts replaced oaths. Consider what you would have done if your ancestors' honor pulled one way and your children's future tugged the other. For the men who enforced this settlement, daily life was a campaign of routine. A legionary woke to orders, policed his contubernum, drilled with pila, and labored with shovel and saw. He ate grain porridge, cheese, and sour wine. He gambled, rode home, and patched sandals. Pay arrived as stipendium, sometimes late, sometimes sweetened by a general's donative. Promotion to the centurionate meant scars, responsibility, and better rations. Outside the rampart, the canopy grew, a strip of taverns, workshops, shrines, and families whose livelihoods depended on the garrison. Soldiers weren't supposed to marry, but many formed stable unions. Archaeology whispers their names from wooden tablets found at Vindolanda. Birthday invitations, requisitions for socks, lists of grain and beer. The machine had a heartbeat, and it sounded domestic. Auxiliaries stitched the provinces to the legions. A Balearic slinger, a Syrian archer, a Batavian horseman, men without citizen rights at enlistment, earned pay, and after long service, the bronze diploma that granted citizenship to them and their children. Their skills changed Roman tactics. Their presence changed Roman society. Tombstones along the Rhine and Danube named them with pride, blending local gods with Latin epitaphs. Altars record vows to Jupiter, Mithras, or Dolichanes, showing how belief moved with battalions. Consider what you would have done if a recruiter offered steady food, armor, and a path to status. Do you take the empire's deal and carry its eagle, or guard your village and hope its walls hold? Conquest remapped economies. When Pompey cleared the sea lanes, grain moved again from Africa and Sicily. Prices calmed, cities breathed, and merchants risked long voyages without calculating ransom. Amphorae stamped with workshop marks piled up in rubbish mounds like Monte Testaccio, a mountain of broken jars that silently records the flow of olive oil feeding Rome. Freedmen ran shipping firms, tax farming houses, and warehouses near river ports. In towns from Gaul to Syria, Forums and basilicas standardized transactions, and magistrates, the decuriones, guaranteed local budgets, often with their own fortunes. The empire's promise was predictability. The empire's demand was revenue. Unknown to many councils, the honor of office could become a fiscal trap that devoured estates. Urban life absorbed conquest into habit. In Rome and provincial capitals, aqueducts delivered water to baths where citizens of every rank practiced a ritual of cleanliness and gossip that functioned as civic glue. The grain dole fed the urban poor, sometimes a blessing, sometimes a lever in political bargaining. Tenement blocks, insula, rose high and burned often. The rich retreated to domus with mosaics telling myths and meals telling status. Slaves cleaned, cooked, taught, and counted. Some were branded, some cherished. Many manumitted into a class of freedmen who owed duty to their patrons and ambition to themselves. Law shaped these relationships with a precision that still echoes. Contracts, guardianship, inheritance, all framed in Latin, all transportable across the world, Rome claimed. Religion traveled the same roads as recruits and rent. Local gods kept their names while adopting Roman titles. Sulla became Minerva at Bath. Celtic horses met Epona on Latin altars. Jupiter reigned everywhere, but often as Jupiter of a place, a hill, a river. Mystery cults like Mithras drew soldiers into cave-like shrines where ranks met in secrecy. The cult of Isis promised salvation as surely as the emperor promised order. On Trajan's column, priests and sacrifices bracket bridges and battering rams, a reminder that Rome sanctified engineering as much as it honored courage. Consider what you would have done when officials asked your town to build a temple to the imperial family. Refuse and mark yourself suspect, or worship and weave your future into Rome's rituals? Trajan made the Danube into a corridor of change. His engineers carved roads into cliffs, planted forts at intervals, and threw a bridge across the river so massive that its foundations still anchor the bank. In Dacia, he crushed a proud kingdom, then organized a new province that fed the treasury with gold and the army with recruits. At Sarmizegetusa, ruined sanctuaries and later Roman streets show a shift from tribal ritual to civic plan. The column in Rome narrates not only battles but carpentry, surgery, and diplomacy. Men hauling timber become as memorable as men hurling pala. The revelation is simple. Logistics doesn't just win wars, it remakes landscapes and lifetimes. Aurelian confronted the opposite problem, how to protect a core scarred by victory. His walls around Rome were a confession and a promise. They acknowledged that mobile defense had failed during the crisis, and they promised that the capital would not again be naked to panic. The bricks still stand, courses upon courses, measuring a late empire's fear and decisiveness. Coin reforms tried to restore trust in money. Food distribution stabilized a city that could riot as efficiently as it could rejoice. Out in the provinces, veterans received land that bound them to their emperor's success, while municipal elites juggled duties they could no longer afford. Stability arrived, but it carried the price tag of centralization. The most intimate evidence of this world lies in things people never meant to preserve. Curse tablets scratched with hopes for justice against thieves who stole cloaks from baths. Lead tags tied to amphorae naming exporters and consignees. Graffiti measuring affection and politics. Military discharge diplomas folded and kept like treasures. Inscriptions on tombs and naming a centurion's campaigns and a freedwoman's virtues. Bread carbonized in a bakery, its stamp proving a supply chain as real as any battle line. The real shock is that empire felt ordinary most days. The extraordinary arrived with a levy, an audit, a requisition, or a march. Consider what you would have done if Rome's order made your life safer, but your soul restless. Yet daily life also set timers that would one day explode. Professional armies required steady cash. Veterans demanded land. Cities begged for repairs they couldn't fund. Expansion had fed the system. Consolidation strained it. Hadrian sensed the math and chose walls over horizons. But even limits need administration that never sleeps. When plague, debasement, and invasion aligned, communities that had traded autonomy for predictability learned what imperial fatigue feels like. The lesson is brutal and modern. Systems that win wars must also win peacetime. If you were emperor, where would you pivot? Push the frontiers again, or harden them and risk slow decline? Why would an empire that won by moving forward decide to stop, build walls, and teach its soldiers to wait? Why would a republic that feared kings invite commanders to rule? The turning points were choices made in crises, each one tactically sound and strategically corrosive. Marius opened the ranks to the poor to save Italy. Sulla marched on Rome to save the Constitution. Caesar crossed a stream to save himself and, he claimed, the state. Trajan raced to the Persian Gulf to crown Rome. Hadrian pulled back to keep it alive. Aurelian welded the fragments with iron. Unknown to them, the math of logistics, loyalty, and law had shifted. The battlefield was no longer just terrain, it was the state itself. Consider what you would have done standing at each fork: reform, transgress, advance, or consolidate. Marius faced a manpower crisis. Italy bled from wars against Jugurtha and then against Rome's own allies. Property qualifications kept willing bodies out. He removed the barrier and let the capiti censi enlist, promising pay, equipment, and, at discharge, land. Tactically, it worked. Cohorts filled with men drilled to exhaustion, carrying their world on their backs, moving faster than levies and staying cohesive under shock. Strategically, he flipped the chain of loyalty. The Senate did not hand out plots after the campaign, the general did. A veteran's farm, his pension, his honor, flowed through one patron whose name he cheered in the line of battle. The political costs were delayed and disguised by victories at Aquae Sextio and Vercellae. A micro-history tells the change plain. A recruit from rural Etruria, illiterate when he joined, learned to pack, march, and obey. He also learned whose favor would decide whether his sons ate. Inscriptions from later veteran colonies, Mariana in Corsica bears his name, and under later leaders Arilote and Forum Iuli, trace a pattern of settlements that stitched soldiers into landscapes. The army had become a career ladder standing inside politics. Consider what you would have done if you were Marius. Watch the state choke on its rules or break them and trust history to thank you. Sulla was the first harvest of that reform. When a tribune's law stripped him of the Mithridatic command, he appealed not to courts but to cohorts. Men who had shared his sieges and his pay marched with him across the Pomerium, that tradition treated as sacred. The tactic was operational: seize key places, control entrances, force the vote. The strategy was constitutional warfare. Demonstrate that legality without legions was a costume. His later victories in Greece, financed by temple plunder and felled groves, confirmed that a general could invent logistics when the treasury refused. The proscriptions that followed his return were grisly bookkeeping: fund troops, settle veterans, terrify rivals. A centurion could now point to a farm deed won by a head on a list and know exactly which side of the state fed him. The Republic survived in rituals but changed in substance. Unknown to optimates celebrating Sulla's retirement, they were living under a new physics. Power had mass, it moved along roads with eagles, and once accelerated, it would not stop at curbs of law. Caesar recognized the same equation and solved it for himself. Ordered to dismiss his legions before standing for consul, he read the demand as a sentence. He chose the Rubicon in the momentum that followed. Tactically, he moved with terrifying speed, collecting arsenals, treasuries, and towns whose elites preferred clemency to martyrdom. Strategically, he weaponized legitimacy. Every proclamation framed his advance as defense of tribunician rights in the peace of Italy. The risk was absolute. If he hesitated and lost tempo, he would be trapped between law and force, hated by both. The decision to keep marching created facts. Pompey evacuated Italy to gather strength, ceding Caesar interior lines across the peninsula. The war that followed, Pharsalus the Keystone, proved that an army drilled to act without orders could turn a thin line into a shield and a hammer. Yet the murder that ended Caesar's life revealed the final irony. You can conquer the Senate. You cannot stab an idea back into power. Consider what you would have done in his place. Accept a trial engineered to ruin you, or roll the dice on your veteran's love and your opponent's hesitation, knowing that even a win might end under knives in a portico. Under the emperors, the most consequential turn came quietly. Trajan drove east with the confidence of a commander who could turn rivers into roads. Dacia fell after sieges that married artillery to engineering. A bridge of unprecedented scale leapt the Danube. Columns of supply bent to his will. Then he pressed into Mesopotamia, capturing cities whose names promised Alexander's echo. The map reached its widest breadth. The problem was arithmetic. Every spur of conquest created new front to garrison, new roads to repair, new warehouses to guard, and longer convoys to protect from desert and raid. When Trajan died on the return, his heir read the same numbers and chose differently. Hadrian withdrew from the exposed salient, fortified, and standardized defense. His wall in Britain, mile castles, turrets, forts tied by a military road, was less a fortress than a filter, a customs barrier with teeth. Along the Danube and Rhine, watchtowers blinked signals, and patrol paths wore into the turf. In the east, lime systems organized depth rather than distance. Archaeology shows the policy in stone and soil, inscriptions naming auxiliary cohorts stationed for decades, barracks hearths packed with the detritus of families, writing tablets recording the price of grain and the transfer of boots. Strategically, the doctrine pivoted from decisive battle to deterrent presence, from movement to management. Consider what you would have done with the treasury straining: chase the horizon and risk bleeding the core, or harden the borders and accept the romance of advances over. The next turn was not a decision, but a cascade. In the 3rd century, plague and inflation hollowed the tax base. New enemies pressed with heavier cavalry and better bows. The army's own promotion ladder turned legions into electorates. Emperors rose on shields and died in ditches. The empire fractured: Postumus's Gallic Empire in the northwest, Zenobia's Palmyrene kingdom in the east, Rome in the middle, stunned. Coins tell the panic. Silver content shrank until radiate pieces flashed like tin. Hoards such as the vast Cunetio deposit in Britain, buried around the time of Aurelian, testify to people who preferred to hide money rather than trust markets or magistrates. On the Euphrates, Dura Europos fell, its walls packed with hasty earthworks and its houses painted with unit insignia, archaeology frozen mid-defense. The limes were no longer lines. They were patchworks of crisis response. Tactically, the legions adapted. More cavalry, more mobile detachments, more emphasis on speed to smash incursions before they spread. Strategically, the state centralized, because only a single hand could coordinate whirling fronts and collapsing revenues. Aurelian, bred in the barracks, understood. He sprinted from battle to battle, annihilated Palmyra's field armies at Amai and Emesa, crushed Tetricus in the west, and then built the Aurelian walls around Rome, a belt of brick that confessed vulnerability and promised endurance. He reformed the coinage, punished corruption, and inscribed his claim on currency: Restitutor Orbis. Consider the drama under the policy: a provincial merchant bearing a pot of coins by night, a cavalryman swearing to a new emperor before the old one's name is scrubbed from an altar, a city elder calculating whether to back Palmyra or Rome and praying he guessed right. Unknown to Aurelian, a forged dossier would trigger his murder, proving that even restoration could not cure instability baked into promotion by murder. Across these turns, a pattern hardens. Tactical brilliance fixes a present danger, then unlocks a distant one. Professionalization saves armies and personalizes loyalty. Marches on Rome save commands and destroy norms. Expansion crowns prestige and multiplies costs. Consolidation buys time and concedes momentum. Crisis centralization restores unity and mortgages trust. Archaeology tracks the oscillation. Veteran colonies stamped in stone. Frontier walls crawling over hills. Hordes sleeping under fields. Bureaucratic inscriptions chiseling rules into places that once needed none. The strategic lesson is not cynicism, it is arithmetic. Legitimacy is a supply line. Logistics is doctrine. Loyalty is a currency that debases when overissued. Consider what you would have done, knowing the bill always arrives. Which long-term cost would you choose to pay? Why did Rome's victories outlive the men who won them? And why do their choices still shape how states fight and rule? When Scipio turned learning into a weapon, when Marius turned pay into policy, when Sulla turned siegecraft on his own city, they weren't just winning battles. They were drafting the operating system of empire. The consequences reach from ancient ditch lines to modern highways, from a centurion's oath to standing armies that police borders today. Consider what you would have done at each hinge: favor heroics, or invest in systems that multiply competence. First, the machine itself became the model. Roman victory taught that logistics isn't back office, it's the front line. Camps as standard kit, roads as arteries, river crossings as projects. States that learned from Rome built forces with trained cadres, supply chains that outlast winners, and engineering units that transform terrain. Even failure copied Rome. Overreach looks the same in every century. Lines stretched until they fray, currencies diluted, emergency powers extended because normal ones can't pay the bills. Scipio Africanus set the tempo of adaptation. He studied Hannibal's reconnaissance, deception, and combined arms, and institutionalized the habit of learning faster than the enemy. His surprise storm of New Carthage, his controlled absorption of elephants at Zama, and his use of cavalry to turn the enemy's rear taught a durable lesson: seize initiative by mastering the environment. Unknown to him, he wrote the preface to modern operational art: define decisive points, arrange lines of operation, and strike where the opponent's system is brittle. Marius professionalized that impulse. By recruiting the poor and standardizing equipment, he created soldiers who thought of service as a career, not a levy. Tactically, cohorts trained to act in depth. Strategically, the state acquired a tool that could be sent anywhere, anytime. But the real shock was political. The pension, the plot of land, the bonus on discharge, those became levers in a general's hand. Later, strongmen would pull them hard. If you were designing a military today, how would you separate professional pride from personal patronage? Sulla proved the nightmare case. His march on Rome turned legions into voters with swords. Prescriptions paid payrolls. Constitutional edits backed by bayonets redefined legitimacy. He demonstrated that a siege mentality at home, lists, confiscations, emergency courts, can be more efficient than debate, and therefore fatally tempting. The legacy is a warning etched in Latin. Once armies arbitrate politics, every crisis invites a commander, not a compromise. Pompey broadened the field to theater command. Against pirates, he divided the Mediterranean into sectors, synchronized sweeps, mixed pressure, and amnesty, and finished the job before opponents could adapt. He then rebuilt the East with administrative patience: client kings, provincial boundaries, tax systems. The lesson outlived him: control the commons, impose a clock, and marry operations to governance. Modern states that secure sea lanes, organize air corridors, and stabilize markets are walking in Pompey's wake. Caesar fused velocity with narrative. He made bridges into manifestos, invasions into press releases, and commentaries into political armor. His audacity depended on engineering and discipline. His survival depended on telling the story before enemies could. And his clemency was as calculated as any cavalry charge: turn foes into clients, deprive rivals of martyrs, and make the forgiving hand look like a crown. He taught successors that controlling the timeline and the tail can win wars twice: once in the field, once in the forum. Trajan built legitimacy in stone. He made rivers obey with bridges, mountains yield to roads, and cities blossom with markets and forums. His column captured the anonymous heroes of Conquest: carpenters, surgeons, engineers, and told citizens that order comes from structure, not just valor. Infrastructure became ideology. The modern corollary is plain: a state that wants durable consent must leave useful monuments, ports that work, grids that endure, laws that travel. Aurelian revealed the crisis playbook: concentrate force, move faster than usurpers can coordinate, punish treason hard, and protect the heartland with visible fortification. His walls around Rome recalibrated defense from mobile hope to permanent insurance. His coin reforms tried to reattach value to the imperial word. Restitutor orbis on currency wasn't boast alone. It was policy packed into metal. Every later government that stabilizes money to stabilize morale is repeating his insight. So what did this do to the world that came after? It embedded three durable propositions. First, professionalism beats enthusiasm over time, provided pay is predictable and leadership competent. Second, engineering and logistics set strategies ceiling. Courage works within supply limits. Third, legitimacy flows along supply lines. Pay troops on the dot, repair bridges before speeches, and publish a story of order people can believe. Ignore any one of these, and the others collapse. Archaeology turns these abstractions into evidence. At Alesia, the trapped fields and ditches mirror Caesar's diagrams, proving that earthworks can multiply outnumbered courage. Along the Danube at Drobeta, the ghost foundations of Trajan's bridge fix a logistical miracle to geography. Aurelian's walls still stride across Rome's neighborhoods. Tile stamps name legions, discharge diplomas, record citizenship for auxiliary veterans. Tombstones list campaigns like resumes. Coin hoards, such as the massive Cunetio deposit, map fear and reform. A spike of Aurelianic issues tells of crisis and attempted cure. The human stories inside these structures carried the consequences forward. A Gallic aristocrat who took Roman citizenship passed Latin to his sons and patronage to his clients. Within 2 generations, his grandchild sits on a city council that recruits for the legions. A centurion retired to a colonia arbitrates local disputes because neighbors trust the man who kept order on a frontier road. A Syrian archer's daughter marries a craftsman in a Danubian town. Their family becomes Roman by habit and law, not by ancestry. Unknown to them, their names will survive on stone long after commanders' boasts fade. But the real shock is how Rome's solutions still tempt. Emergency powers that deliver grain and safety are hard to rescind. Military forces that can fix floods and crush pirates are asked to solve politics. Narratives that sanctify order smother disagreement. The Roman pattern is a durable seduction. Beat over deliberation, system over spontaneity, walls over wagers. It worked, until it didn't. Overextension bankrupted trust, and trust, not treasure, is the final reserve of empire. For contemporary leaders, the syllabus is blunt. Build resilient systems, not saviors. Design incentives that reward institutions, not entourages. Balance reach with repair. Every new frontier requires 4 garrisons you haven't budgeted yet. Treat information like a maneuver arm, but ground it in truth, or you'll mint denarii that shine and shatter. Train officers to improvise within doctrine, as Rome did with its centurions, and you'll outlast shocks that kill brittle hierarchies. And always ask whether a victory today mortgages consent tomorrow. Consider what you would have done in their place. If you could clear a sea in 90 days by granting power to one man, would you? If you could win glory with a bridge across a frozen river, would you build it knowing you were building expectations you might never meet? If you could reconquer a fractured realm by promising restoration stamped on coin and wall, would you risk centralized paranoia? The past won't answer, but it insists the bill comes due. Why do bridges and walls still argue strategy long after the men who ordered them turned to dust? Why does a double ring of ditches around a forgotten hill still teach commanders more than a library of maxims? Because Rome's 7 savages, Scipio, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, Trajan, Aurelian, didn't merely win. They engineered repeatable victory. Interior lines at Alesia, theater control against pirates. Bridges that defied rivers. Walls that admitted the empire's fear and contained it. Each choice wrote doctrine into earth and stone. Consider what you would have done with the same tools. Build momentum or build memory. Strip the armor and you find human stakes driving policy. Scipio marched with ghosts of a father and uncle killed. Marius, a new man, promised dignity to poor if they fought as professionals. Sulla sought revenge in the language of law, then replaced law with lists. Pompey chased time and learned Senate feared efficiency. Caesar wagered that mercy buys obedience faster than terror, and found knives travel quicker than gratitude. Trajan built legitimacy into the ground. Aurelian, forged by panic, welded a realm and paid with his life. The machine they refined remains a central lesson. Cohorts as maneuver blocks, centurions as doctrine made flesh, camps erected with the predictability of sunrise, logistics that converted grain into reach. These turned courage into policy. Archaeology refuses romance and confirms routine. The trap pits at Alesia Saint-Irene, tile stamps from Dacian forts naming legions, the foundations of Trajan's Danube bridge at Drobeta, Aurelian's brick courses still binding neighborhoods together. Evidence shows a state that could lay down a grid of order faster than enemies could improvise chaos. And that is why Roman victories kept paying interest long after parades ended. What does this mean now? Professional forces still beat crowds, but only if pay, training, and purpose are real. Engineering still sets the ceiling on ambition. A bridge or port built today is a campaign plan for decades. Narratives still move faster than armies. Leaders who tell the story first often own the space in which decisions are judged. Yet the warning stands. Emergency powers are addictive. Sulla's lists, Pompey's extraordinary commands, Caesar's perpetual office, Aurelian's centralization. Each solved a crisis and normalized the tool that solved it. Efficiency without restraint becomes a constitution of exceptions. Consider grain ships late in markets angry. Would you grant one commander sweeping control of sea lanes if he promised results in 90 days? Consider a frontier bleeding recruits and budgets. Would you drive a road over a river and swear the line would hold because the bridge says so? Consider a treasury thin as foil. Would you stamp coins with restoration and count on faith to close the gap? Rome often answered yes, and it worked, until the bill arrived with interest and a dagger's point. Unanswered questions sharpen the lesson. Could Rome have kept Mesopotamia without breaking its logistics? Or was Hadrian right to trade space for time? Did Marius foresee the political personalization of the legions? Or did necessity blind him to the second-order costs? If Caesar had lived to draft a durable settlement, would a principate by consent have emerged sooner? Or was violence already baked into the machine? If Aurelian had survived a decade longer, could fiscal reform and walls have stabilized a new equilibrium? The sources argue, the ground whispers, the debate is itself a training exercise in strategic humility. If you want to test these ideas, follow the stones. Read the spiral of Trajan's column as a manual. Walk Aurelian's walls as an emergency planning syllabus. Trace ghost rectangles of camps and feel how repetition becomes power. Read the commentaries with suspicion and respect, hearing brilliance and salesmanship. The past is a gym for judgment. Use it. Build systems that outlive heroes, and heroes who obey systems, or you'll relearn Rome's lessons the hard way, under pressure when it's too late to improvise. Here's the challenge. Which general changed Rome most, and what would you have done? Choose, defend it, and test the claim against ditch lines, coin hoards, and laws chiseled into provincial stone. This story ends where inquiry begins. Follow roads out of Alesia across the Danube, along Aurelian's walls. The map remains. The choices do too.